What happened to you when you were young that you didn't understand until years later? Hi Reddit guys, subscribe now, or I will throw an egg to your window. Potentially not safe for work. I was in LA at the age of 10 and ended up with sunburn as I am English and not used to the heat. My dad took me to the restroom where we shared a stall, and he helped me take my t-shirt off so that he could reapply after sun. This was pretty painful. I was screaming inside a locked stall, saying that it hurt, so was surprised when a burly guy forced open the door, looking quite annoyed at my dad, who explained correctly what was happening. I grimaced through the pain and agreed as best as possible. Only years later that I realized that burly guy was a top bloke, and that the pain he was trying to save me from wasn't that kind of chafing. This makes me happy that there are people out there that won't just turn a blind eye to these things. Also happy that the man was sensible and accepted the dad's explanation plus child's corroboration of the actual innocent circumstances. Righteous fighter plus reasonable listener. The best combination. Sometimes we would stop at my aunt's work so that my dad could go in and talk to her. I wasn't allowed in because I was a kid and it was an adult place. The only other things that ever got the descriptor adult were adult films, which were not for kids because of all the X. So I happily assumed that my aunt worked someplace where all sorts of X was happening. Years later, I was driving by and noticed that it was a retirement home. This is like the opposite of every other story on this thread. When I was about 4 or 5 we got 2 very important life-changing bits of medical news. THD first was my baby brother was on the way. The second was that my father was diagnosed with acute lymphoma and had about 2 weeks to live. When I was little I had no grasp of how serious cancer was. My mum told me my dad was sick, but that was about it. I remember my mum kept insisting that I spend time with him, but I would always get angry when he got too tired to play or kicked me out so he could vomit from the chemo. I remember one night in particular where my school had my first back to school night, carnival. They had all sorts of rides and stuff. My dad had just had extensive surgery and had staples across his entire neck. I used to joke that he was like Frankenstein. My dad managed to make it through the big presentation the teacher made to the whole class and their parents, but barely. I thought this was boring, but would be worth sitting through, because I would get to go on carnival rides afterwards. But my dad had to leave. He couldn't even stand up. I could not understand how my strong 6 feet 4 inches father could be so selfish. If he could sit through the boring part, why not the good part? I to this day feel tremendously guilty over how I treated him and the tantrum I threw when my mum was struggling to hold my dad up and my dad was struggling just to stay conscious. Fortunately the doctors were wrong. He made it well past the 2 weeks and eventually beat cancer 5 years later. It took years before I understood how seriously sick he really was. He had gotten down to 90 pounds, but to me he was still a superman. This is so sad, but I'm glad it has a happy ending. I can't imagine how you felt when you realized what was going on after the fact. We had this gym teacher in elementary school that would bring a bag of apples to class and give the girls one if they'd give him a massage. I was pissed, because I absolutely loved apples. Still do. I thought it was unfair that only the girls got apples. So I told my teacher how Mr. So-and-so would only let the girls massage him for apples and we had to do sports. I was not an athletic child, so the idea of eating apples versus gym activities greatly appealed to me. I had to go to the principal's office to tell them my story, which was basically this is bullet. Everyone should be getting apples, or no one should be getting apples. Other students corroborated my story and soon enough so-and-so was gone. I'm basically picturing you as Butters in this story. Lulu, I've got some apples. When I was 6 we used to play a lot with Pokemon cards at school. One recess I left my deck inside the classroom. When I came back my Charizard was missing from it. 3 days later a friend from class came to me and told me he found my Charizard outside in a bush. Took me 10 years to realize he stole it from me and then got cold feet and gave it back. That is actually a good story to me. It shows development, honesty and growth. People don't pay attention to the fact that it is hard to be honest. There are so many people who don't even try, and then there are those who think it is the only way and people who are morally weak. But that little boy saw the easy way. He saw the prize and he took it. The reward outweighed the risk, and he scored big. But through his parents' example, or a TV special, he realized that his dishonesty would hurt someone, and that his enjoyment and gain maybe shouldn't be put ahead of someone else. I bet that kid turned out okay. In kindergarten I had a best friend named Daniel and we played with toy dinosaurs and traded them all the time. January comes around and I invite him to my birthday party I was having at my house. He never showed up that day, and my mum told me that day he wasn't going to be able to make it as well as he won't be able to come to school again. Little kid me was like, okay, I'll see him later. He died in a car crash on the way to my birthday party. Frick. I lost one of my teeth when I was 7 years old, and so I was so excited to get money and stuff from the tooth fairy. I put the tooth under the pillow and I was ready to get my prize for losing a tooth. The next morning, I woke up and the tooth was gone, but no present. I went and told my dad about how I just got scammed from the tooth fairy and he was like, oh, the tooth fairy had to run fast so she gave me the money to give to you. He then pulls out his wallet and gives me the $2 that the tooth fairy gave him. I was so happy, but still wondered why the tooth fairy was in such a rush. $2. I got 50 cents. Damn cheap ass tooth fairy. My daughter lost her first tooth recently and was heartbroken when the tooth fairy left a dollar bill. I asked her how much she thought she was going to get and she said 10 million. The way she said it, there was zero doubt that she would get that much. It wasn't a wish or a dream that she could have 10 million, but it was a cold hard fact. That's the deal. 10 million a tooth. It's $10 million these days. Man, inflation is crazy. My mum was really intent on having my younger brother believe in things like Santa and the tooth fairy for as long as possible. Once she forgot to replace his tooth with money. He asked her about it and in her infinite wisdom she had me. I got home before everyone else. Make a letter from the tooth fairy to explain why it was late. I said that 2 kids had gotten into a fight and knocked every single one of their teeth out. So, she ran out of quarters and had to run home to get more. I was quite proud of the story, and he bought it. But he started having doubts. So he left a note with one of his teeth asking for proof that the tooth fairy was real. My mum wrote him a letter back and taped a small lock of black hair to it. All of my family has blonde hair except for my dad, but he keeps his very short. He bought it hook, line and sinker and didn't find out the tooth fairy wasn't real until well after he lost all his teeth. Had that note on his wall for years. Turns out the hair was from a single black spot on my grandma's dog that was living with us at the time. Pure genius. When I was 6 and my brother was 4 we used to walk to our cousin's house which was 2 houses down. One evening, we asked our mother if we could go over and she said yes and lets us walk over by ourselves. While we're walking, this car drives up to us and asks if we knew where the nearest McDonald's was and if we'd like to come with him. I told him we weren't allowed to eat McDonald's without our mother's permission and turned to get her to ask if we were allowed. She was already running outside to get us when the car sped off. I was around 15 when I was reminiscing with my family and she brought it up. Creepy realization. I have a similar one, mentioned in this thread. I was in our front yard, playing. This guy pulls up across the street, and yes my name, and says my mum told him to pick me up. I'm like, why would she do that? She's just inside the house. So I ask, do you have the phrase? Because my mum told me if she sends someone to pick me up from school, she'll give them a secret code phrase. Catch you later, alligator. For those curious. He just looked at me and told me to get in again. I told him I was sorry, but I wasn't allowed to go unless he knew the code phrase. Then my mum swoops out of the house, picks me up, and he takes off. I was super excited because I got to meet a police officer a short while later, and he let me look at his police car. This is a cute story. Because of the police car thing, not the pedophile thing. Not the pedophile thing. Way to jump to conclusions. He may have just been a murderer. Defending my mum from my dad since he slapped her butt cheek. In the laundry room. When I was like 6 and supposed to be away with my grandparents. I was the hero. The cock-bloking hero. One time my dad was putting on his swimsuit and he stripped down in front of my mom. I remember freaking out and holding up a towel partition so my mother couldn't see his dad dong. Oh boy. Put your goddamn cock away, dad. We don't want to see it. Didn't really happen to me, but when I was 14 I suddenly realized that those 2 giraffes at the zoo when I was 7 that I shouted about to everyone else weren't giving each other piggybacks. Oh, that made me smile. That's great. Dad used to have a shop in the basement where he would work on things in the evening. He used to smoke while he was down there, and I wasn't allowed to be in the shop because smoke is bad for kids. I used to sneak down covert style sometimes and he'd catch me and shoo me out, all while laughing and smiling. The smoke smelled different than regular smoke, but I was little and didn't think much of it. Years later when I first, knowingly, smelled pot, I instantly recognized the smell. Dad used to smoke pot in the basement every night. This really reminds me of something too. It wasn't someone we knew, I think, just a stranger on the street, but one day I asked one of my parents what weird kind of cigarette that person was smoking, and they said it was a herbal cigarette. It was several years later, well after I'd been taught about weed, that I suddenly put 2 and 2 together. That's actually a clever response. When I was young, my parents would play cards with friends nearly every weekend while the kids were banished to the basement. Meanwhile they all shared a cigarette. I now know they were passing a joint. Also sometimes my mum would lock her bedroom door and we'd smell smoke and she'd tell us our house was built on Indian burial grounds and just likely haunted by native smoking peace pipes. Haunted by native smoking peace pipes. How long did it take you to catch this one? Okay Reddit guys, subscribe now, or I will throw an egg to your window.